Hi, this is Andrew, and I'm back with a video on stream of consciousness and verisimilitude in Virginia Woolf's To The Lighthouse. Let's start by talking about my goals for this video. The first is a look at how Virginia Woolf uses stream of consciousness, meaning we're going to be taking a look at the line-by-line mechanics of her writing and how that functions on a micro level to convey her message. And the second is the message of her writing, that is, what theme or insight or idea is she trying to convey? So this kind of falls into the perennial literary theme of form versus content, which is the idea that form, which is how you present a work, and content, which is what it means, are necessarily intertwined. The way something is told to you influences what it means. So in this spirit, we're going to be thinking about why Virginia Woolf may have chosen this particular form for her stream of consciousness, and how effective this particular form of stream of consciousness is at conveying the content that she wants to get across to the reader. Essentially, what are the pros and cons of telling the story in the way it's told? So before we jump into any close readings of particular passages, let's define the terms. So I'm actually going to be defining stream of consciousness kind of loosely, which is maybe a bad idea considering that my entire video is about stream of consciousness, but whatever. So I'm going to define it as any attempt to render human consciousness in textual form, or to track the flow of human thoughts and put that down into text. But the standard definition often includes an extra condition that, oh, maybe you disregard punctuation, or you jump wildly from one thought to another, making free associations, and it's really rambling and chaotic. I'm not going to define it that way, and we'll see why later. As for verisimilitude, it just means the quality of being realistic. You could use the term realism, but you probably shouldn't because realism refers to a specific school of literature, and so we use the term verisimilitude instead. So the adjective form is verisimilar, which is basically a fancier way of saying realistic for a work of literature. So what are we taught about stream of consciousness in school? We're taught that it represents the volatile and capricious and unpredictable flow of human thought. And we're told that this is how the human mind works. We're told that the human mind is wildly associative. We'll think about one thing, and that'll lead us to another, and that'll lead us to a third thing, and that'll remind us of that thing that happened 10 years ago, and that'll make us think about this thing that happened in our childhood, etc., etc. For example, I could be like, oh, I see a lamp, and that's light, and that reminds me of the sun, and Icarus flew close to the sun, and his wings melted, and Icarus's dad was Daedalus, and Daedalus built the labyrinth that housed the Minotaur, and the Minotaur was a cow, and cows eat grass. So that's obviously really exaggerated, but it's kind of the stereotypical thing that comes to mind when you think of stream of consciousness. So enough of me just talking about books, let's actually get to reading something. I'm going to start off actually with a passage that isn't from Woolf. It's from James Joyce's Ulysses. Joyce is one of the other authors who's extremely famous for his use of stream of consciousness, and I think this is a prototypical example, very much in line with my performance just now. This is from the perspective of the character Molly Bloom. I'm not going to provide any plot details, and it isn't really a spoiler, just because we're mostly interested in the form rather than the content here. No, he hadn't a mustache, that was Gardner. Yes, I can see his face clean shaven. Foresee, frong that train again, weeping tone once in the dear dad days. Beyond recall, close my eyes, breathe my lips. Forward kiss, sad look, eyes open, piano, ear over the world. The mist began, I hate that, it's sped. Comes loves, sweet song. Oh, I lit that out full when I get in front of the footlights again. Kathleen Kiernan, you're a lot of squealers. Miss this, miss that, miss the other. A lot of sparrow farts skidding around talking about politics. They know as much about my backside anything in the world to make themselves some way interesting. So yeah, this is a particularly exemplary stream of consciousness passage from Joyce, just because it's part of one long sentence. There's no punctuation at all. There's no regard for grammar. It jumps from one topic to another. There are onomatopoetic sounds that aren't really words, like foresee, frong. I have no idea what it means. Maybe that's simple onomatopoeia. Maybe there's an explanation in the annotated Ulysses. Regardless, it doesn't make very much sense. It defies logic, order, reason, grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, all of the things that we're taught to adhere to in school go out the window when you're James Joyce and you're trying to represent what's going on inside our heads. Now let's look at a passage from Woolf. So bear in mind this is stream of consciousness using my loose definition, the one that just emphasizes the author attempting to portray the flow of thoughts in a person's mind. It's not going to be fragmentary like the other one. And we're going to take this and compare it to the Joyce passage and see how each one of them works. This is from the perspective of Mrs. Ramsay in To The Lighthouse. Mrs. Ramsay is the central character in the book, in that she's the character around which the entire book revolves. I don't know whether it would be accurate to call her a main character, because the book jumps back and forth from different people's minds, and there's this one section where it kind of possesses the house even, and uses the perspective of the house, and it's complicated. So let's just say she's the central character, she's hosting a dinner, and she's kind of been trying to matchmake people. So this is how it goes. Foolishly, she had set them opposite each other. That could be remedied tomorrow. If it were fine, they should go for a picnic. Everything seemed possible. Everything seemed right. Just now, but this cannot last, she thought, dissociating herself from the moment while they were all talking about boots. Just now she had reached security. She hovered like a hawk suspended, like a flag floated in an element of joy which filled every nerve of her body fully and sweetly, not noisily, solemnly rather. For it arose, she thought, looking at them all eating there, from husband and children and friends, all of which rising in this profound stillness, she was helping William Banks to this one very small piece more imputed into the depths of the earthenware pot, seemed now for no special reason to stay there like a smoke, like a fume rising upwards, holding them safe together. Nothing need be said, nothing could be said. There it was, all around them. It partook, she felt, carefully helping Mr. Banks to a specially tender piece of eternity, as she had already felt about something different once before that afternoon. There is a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights, in the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby, so that again tonight she had the feeling she had had once today already, of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. This is obviously very different from the Joyce, and I've selected it to be different. If you wanted to, you could look elsewhere into the Lighthouse, and you would find passages similar to the Joyce. Not quite as extreme in the lack of punctuation and grammar, but there are still leaps in logic at times. There's volatiles, trains of thought. This one is mostly following one thought to its logical conclusion. The question is, what is the difference between these two passages? I'm going to argue that the difference is the presence of a third-person narrator. In the Joyce, we're exclusively looking at the flow of thoughts in Molly's mind, but here we get a glimpse into Mrs. Ramsay's mind, mediated through the lens of this omniscient narrator who's looking down at the situation, who knows what's going on in her mind, who previously in the book has jumped from mind to mind and narrated things in the third person, pointed out things in the house, pointed out things in the landscape. One technique that Woolf uses here is called free indirect speech. To explain what that is, I'll give a couple of examples. Direct speech would be something like, he sighed. Why is my life so terrible? He asked himself. That's direct because it's a direct quotation. Indirect speech would be, he sighed, asking himself why his life was so terrible. Here the narrator reports what's happening. Free indirect speech would be, he sighed. Why was his life so terrible? The crucial thing about free indirect speech is there's this sort of merging of the third-person narrator and the consciousness of the character. In the example just now, the important phrase is, why was his life so terrible? The phrase is still in the third person because his is used, so we know it's from the perspective of the narrator. But at the same time, it seems to be directly reporting the thoughts of the character, only replacing my with his. If we look back at the Wolf, we see this happening several times. We see it happening at the very beginning. That could be remedied tomorrow. If it were fine, they should go for a picnic. Everything seemed possible. Everything seemed right. That section is essentially directly taken from Mrs. Ramsay's thoughts, and in fact, there's no I, so we don't even see the her. We don't even see the presence of the narrator, even though it is the narrator sort of jumping into her mind. And likewise later we get, nothing need be said, nothing could be said. There it was, all around them. So again, we see this glimpse into her mind, this glimpse into her thoughts. Those are the examples of free and direct speech, which is where the boundary between narrator and character is most blurred. And then we can look at sentences like, just now, but this cannot last, she thought, dissociating herself from the moment while they were all talking about boots. Just now she had reached security. She hovered like a hawk suspended, like a flag floated in an element of joy which filled every nerve of her body fully and sweetly, not noisily, solemnly rather, for it arose, etc., etc. Here we see that the narrator is reporting her thoughts, which doesn't blur the boundary quite as much as free and direct speech does, but it's still the narrator providing insight into the flow of thoughts through her mind. So what's the difference between the Wolf and the Joyce? What effect does the presence of the narrator have? Obviously, what immediately comes to mind is that the Wolf is much more logical, it's much more coherent, it's much more regimented. It's presented as organized thought. It goes from A to B to C to D. You can see the connections very clearly. In fact, you'll notice the writing has elegant metaphors, it's beautifully written. Not to say that the Joyce isn't beautifully written, but this is beautifully written in a sort of classical, grammatically correct, standard English sense, as opposed to the beautiful chaos of the Joyce. But if we compare the Joyce and the Woolf, and we think back to the question of verisimilitude, the idea that stream of consciousness is a way of truthfully or realistically depicting the processes that go on in the human mind, there's a thought that might strike us. The mind does not work like this. The mind just does not work like Woolf's portrayal of it. Our minds are not that organized. Our minds are not that logical. If I'm Mrs. Ramsay and I'm sitting there at the dinner table and everyone around me is talking about boots and I'm helping Mr. Banks to another piece of food, there's absolutely no way I'm going to be constructing a beautiful metaphor for the state of human existence at the same time. Listen to this. There's a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights. In the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby, so that again tonight she had the feeling she had had once today already of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. Does Virginia Woolf expect us to think that Mrs. Ramsay is having such beautiful, profound, elegant thoughts as she's sitting at the dinner table? Is it realistic? Is it verisimilar? In fact, when you think about it, the metaphor and the passage must have taken Woolf, who's one of the greatest writers of the English language, at least a couple hours to come up with. It's just way too coherent to represent the sort of haphazard flow of thoughts that is the human consciousness. So clearly I can just end the video here. We've established that Joyce is a superior writer. We've established that Virginia Woolf does not know how to represent the human consciousness. I made a video on To The Lighthouse just to bash Virginia Woolf because I hate her writing that much. I'm kidding, of course. But this raises a legitimate question, which is, what are Joyce and Woolf doing differently? Joyce is presenting Molly's unfiltered thoughts. So what exactly is Woolf doing?